And I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Now, there's a point where somebody genuinely becomes a legend, which is the point where, so tell me, what do these things have in common? Jacuzzi, diesel, leotard, sandwich. They are all everyday objects and situations named after people. They are people's names that have just become part of the language. And if you have ever been out in the railway station or the cinema and you're looking at one of the information boards and it's crashed, and it's a board that used to be like a poster, except now it's a digital computer system, and you look up to see what time your train is, and it's a Windows blue screen of death. Or you get a JavaScript error on a device where you were trying to order a cheeseburger or something. That, when a device crashes and suddenly you realize that it was trying to be a computer, that has become known as a Kevlin Henney. So folks, please welcome to the Build Stuff stage, the legend, Kevlin Henney.
All right. So do I have sound? Yes, excellent. I don't have visuals because apparently the device that works with every single other device in the universe and is the most reliable, I've never had it fail, has decided today to not talk to the system. So this is kind of like a live Kevlin Henney on two levels. So I'm just going to do the keynote without slides, which is kind of interesting. It also allows me, it means you don't know if I've missed any slides, which is great. It means that the graphics are always high resolution and appropriate. It means you don't know what you're missing. Whatever. This is a talk about agility. Agility does not equal speed. I did a version of this talk a few years ago in the Netherlands, and they had carefully made sure that all of the monitors around the conference venue had the title of the next talk. Except somebody couldn't find the not equals key. Because there isn't a not equals key, you have to go and look through the characters. Or you do what most developers do, which is copy and paste. But they didn't do this. They thought, not equals, that's almost like equals, isn't it? So all around the venue was proclaimed my talk, agility equals speed. And I said, yeah, not quite. So this really is the point. Because why do I have to stand up here and talk about agility not equaling speed? Because that is the way that we have ended up being measured. There was a little thing called the Agile Manifesto, just over 20 years ago, and that's where the term agile got coined and used to describe a new generation of lightweight development processes. Extreme programming, Scrum, even stuff from the early 1990s, DSDM. All of these seem to embody not the same process, but a philosophy. So this is a really important thing. When people wander around going like, oh, we're doing agile, I don't know how you do agile. I have no idea, and I've been part of the community for a very long time. Because agile is two things. One, it is an umbrella term that covers a multitude of different approaches. So whenever I go to an organization and they say, we're doing the agile process, I know that the one thing they're not doing is the agile process, because it doesn't exist. Because that was a kind of a term of unification. There are lots of different ways of being agile. In fact, it's worth going to the dictionary, rather than a blog, to discover what we mean by this term. When we talk about agile, agile is an adjective. Now, why is that important? An adjective is a description of something. It is a property of something. Importantly, it's an observation you can make. You can look at a team and go, they're more agile than they were 6 months ago. You can look at two teams and say, Team A is more agile than Team B. And not just because it's Team A. You can look at them and you can make an observation. It's not a doing word. You can do Scrum. You can do Kanban. But you can't do agile. It's an observation. You can be more agile or less agile. But this has got turned into an industry. Somewhere along the line, the one line, the Agile Manifesto I still think is a great piece of writing. It's a very simple piece of writing. It doesn't describe a process, it describes an attitude. It also, at the beginning, uses this thing called the continuous present tense, which is slightly particular to English. We are uncovering better ways of doing it. We are uncovering. That means we've been doing it, we're now doing it, and we'll continue to do it. We're never done. Okay? There's always a constant process of discovery. 2022 Agile looks different to 2002 Agile. Okay? Because there's new things that we're doing, we're finding out. It's a constant process of discovery. You're never at a point where you say, yep, we are now Agile. If you are, you're not. Okay? So it's an observation. It's a constant process of inquiry and discovery. It's an attitude. And there are a number of values that were described. Now, this is the interesting thing. A number of values, one of which is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Where are we now in 2022 with all of our certifications? And whenever you ask somebody, hey, what are you guys up to? Oh, yeah, so we're doing Agile. We've got Jira. We've got a CI/CD pipeline. Oh, so what is your testing? Oh, we don't do testing. Oh, okay. So CD stands for continuous disaster. And, it's just like you're just throwing shit out of the world and hoping for the best. That's never been different, okay? So there's nothing new about that. But it's all about the processes and tools. We're certified in this and we're certified in that. I'm an independent consultant. And what does independent mean? Independent means I don't work for a company, which means I can say what the hell I want. And I've actually ended up, for one company, I ended up discontinuing my work because they said, do you do Scrum training? Yeah, I do. But I kind of teach a more fundamental approach that's based on a deeper, older idea of what Scrum and agility are. And I said, oh, that's great. That's cool. Do you do certifications? No. Or rather, I can create certificates that prove that you attended my training course. But it's a certificate of attendance. It's not a certificate of competence as issued by various Scrum organizations. It's, oh, okay, thanks, but we need certification. I don't know why they need certification, but it makes them feel good. I'd like to make you feel good by actually telling you stuff that's useful. Other people feel good in different ways. Their choice. But it means I can say rude things about things like safe and other stuff. But we seem to have ended up in a place where we value processes and tools over individuals and interactions. And when we measure people, when we measure teams, and this is where it gets really interesting. So we look at teams and we use words like productivity. Now, productivity has become embedded in the language of business. And for many people who come to English from another language, they are exposed to a whole load of business English, and they are not shown the origin story. Every word has an origin story. Sometimes it's lost to time, but every word has an origin story. When we talk about productivity, what are we actually talking about? Where does productivity come from? It comes from factories. It comes from manufacturing. When somebody says, I'm being more productive, they are saying, I am way more like a factory than I used to be. And it's just like, that's not a good thing. We kind of, somewhere along the line, we lost the individuals and interactions message. So we use this term productivity to the point we forget it's a metaphor. But what is it that we're going to measure in a team? Now, that's an interesting one, because software is curiously invisible. It's very abstract. And when I say it's invisible, I mean it's made of stuff that you can't kick. And I know you've had those days of frustration where you really want to kick it. Okay? As human beings, we are tuned. Through the process of evolution, we are tuned to the physical world. And we are really good at the physical world. We can estimate very, very easily the physical world. And it's just like, when we move to the abstract domain of software, it's invisible and we can't kick it. We can't take our frustrations out on it. So how do we measure what a team is doing? Because when you look at a team of software developers, it is almost indistinguishable from a room full of people looking at pictures of cats on the internet. I'm not saying that you do, but maybe you do. There's a lot of interesting pictures of cats on the internet. And other animals. I don't want to exclude other animals. I mean, there are whole Twitter streams, or there used to be, who knows what will happen after this, devoted to goats and funny sheep and things like that. Llamas, yes, good shout out to the llamas. So the point there is that how do we do this? How do you measure something? Now, when we talk about measuring productivity in a factory, it's very easy because we can look at the number of things that are created and we can look at the number of things per time. Oh, things per time. We have produced more things per time versus less things per time. Okay? We are being more productive. We are producing more things this quarter than we were last quarter. Okay, that's nice and easy. What are the things that we should be measuring? Now, there's a very careful word I put in there, should. What we end up with is, what are the things we can measure? That's a very different question. What are the things we can measure? We can measure lines of code. Yep, thank you very much. Exactly. Wow, this is so easy to get. We are going to measure productivity by lines of code. Oh my goodness. Back to cat memes. You know the cat? Yeah, that one? Yeah? So the point is, we are developers. As developers, you need to be really careful with developers because they're fairly bright and more to the point that they are problem solvers. Software developers are problem solvers and they are creative. You mix these two together in the same person. I mean, it's not quite like a kind of, Superman moment, but it gets close. It's a hell of a superpower, creative and a problem solver. You give me a problem and I will solve it creatively. You want me to produce more lines of code? Oh, I'm on that. I'm absolutely on that. And how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to create a code generator. And what I can do is I can put in a simple, elegant, small piece of code, and out comes monstrous enterprise code. I can take one line of a simple pipeline, a simple Java stream expression, and expand it into 100 lines of loops and variables. You want to measure me by that? I will give you that. Now, many people, but not everyone it seems, knows that lines of code is not a useful measure of productivity. However, some people make a mistake. They then say, lines of code is not a useful metric at all. This is incorrect. If you want to know the number of lines of code in a code base, there is no other metric that comes close. Lines of code is the perfect measure of the number of lines of code. It doesn't tell you anything deep. It just tells you how much stuff you have. More importantly, it tells you how much developers have to deal with. When they walk in, what is the amount of stuff they have to look at? My own experience a number of years ago between two teams in the same company. One was 1 million lines, and the other was 100,000 lines. It took me a few weeks to realize that they actually had about the same amount of functionality. And this isn't, functionality. The systems didn't do the same thing. But when you looked at what the systems did, you go, wait a minute, you guys it's kind of the same amount of functionality and doingness. But one group has a code base that's 10 times larger than the other. So I leave it to your imagination as to know which group wrote tests, which group did code reviews, which group did pair programming, which group ensured that they had a continuous working build, which group refactored to ensure that they actually had a reuse library, which group went home on time. Okay, and then the 100,000 liners who were new to me, the million liners, the 100,000 liners I've worked with for a couple of years, on and off. The million liners are sitting there looking at the 100,000 liners going, we want to be like that. And I say, okay, your code base is so far from being agile. You see, the word agile can be applied to a code base as well, because what does the word mean? The word agile does not mean fast. The word agile means it does have a fast component, but it has another component. The other component relates to responsiveness, ready to change. That's actually the default meaning in English. In other words, there is this idea of being able to turn something around, move it easily. And I said, your code base does not have this capability. So, we're a long way from that. We can set that as a destination, but we can't just do it overnight because they said, we want to be doing refactoring. And I said, where are your unit tests? We don't have any. Okay, let's reduce our ambitions a little bit. This is going to be a journey. It might be a journey that is kind of like from here to the moon, but it's still a journey. So what we have is this observation about teams, about individuals and interactions. That's what produced it, the way the team worked together, how they communicated. And that was reflected in their code base. When I first worked with the 100,000 liners, they were at 50,000 lines of code. And I went back a few months later, having had some time with them, and the boss kind of took me to one side. He says, I'm a little worried. I said, why? He said, well, in the last 3 months, the number of lines of code, it was rising, and then you visited, and now the lines of code has not changed in 3 months. And I said, oh, that's really good. He kind of looked back at me. I said, because that means that what they're doing is they're taking my advice on board. They are refactoring and consolidating the code. They are basically kind of reusing things, throwing things out, finding better ways of expressing things. And I said, let's look at some other numbers. How are the defects? Oh, defects are going down. And what about delivery in terms of hitting ideas or features that you want to have implemented? And he said, well, that's going up. And I said, well, those are the numbers that you want. What's actually happening is that if they weren't adding new features, the number of lines of code would be negative in terms of its direction. It would be going down. Lines of code is a perfect measure of the number of lines of code, but it doesn't tell you anything else unless you have a better context. So let's not measure lines of code as a measure of productivity. So what else do we do? Well, we try and talk about things indirectly. Very popular alternative approaches include things like story points. What is a story point? I don't know. Let's go to the bar and have a drink, because what is a story point? This is a philosophical question. It is an arbitrary unit of measure that is designed to displace us from the physical world so that we don't get distracted by things like deadlines. That's fine, because a deadline can interfere with our understanding of a problem. Because what happens in a negotiation, in a conversation, when somebody says, how long do you think this is going to take? We don't answer that neutrally as objective, rational human beings, because we are subjective, irrational human beings. In fact, I don't even need to use the word subjective and irrational. We are just human beings. With every human being, you get free the capability of irrationality and subjectivity. Even better, you get the ability to fool yourself. So this is the thing. What we are dealing with is something far more complex. That's why we focus on individuals and interactions. We are the hardest part of a software system. So when somebody says, what's the estimate? What you're actually doing is understanding what they want as an answer. There's an implied deadline. There's a negotiation. We never want to let people down, so we go through a little process. And that's not an estimation. That's a negotiation. The estimation, what actually happens is a commitment. We don't offer an estimate. We offer a commitment. There's nothing wrong with these things except we use the wrong names for them. Somebody says, give me an estimate. What they're actually saying is, give me a commitment. Or what somebody hears is, give me a commitment. Again, communication. Once visited a team where we actually managed to get everybody together for a big workshop. When I say everybody, I mean the developers. I mean the product owners, everybody. And what was fascinating is one of the developers was expressing frustration. One of the developers was saying, I find it really difficult because what we have is the desire for an estimate. And with some of the development stuff we're doing, it's new. We don't know yet how long it's going to take because we haven't built this before. Because guess what, folks? This is not manufacturing. Because if it were manufacturing, we'd have built it before. When you build the 1,001st item on a production line, it looks exactly like the 1,000th on the production line. That's how we do quality control in manufacturing. In software, we don't manufacture. Or rather, we do. It's called a compiler. We solved the manufacturing problem in the 1950s. If somebody says, I want a system that's exactly like this, what? That system that's already running? Yes, I want another one that's exactly like this. You say, and here is the source code. Or here is the binary. Or here is Dropbox. You can go and download it from there. The point there is we solved the manufacturing problem. What we are left with is the design problem. Because people don't want, this is not about manufacturing. People don't want the same thing. The whole point of software is not to produce identical things. That's the point of manufacturing. The whole point of software is to produce different things. The value comes in the difference. Somebody normally says, I want something like that, but different. I want something like that, but I need a different technology. I want something like that, but connects to different systems. I want something like that, but the UI wants to be different. I want something that does the same as our old system, but uses a new technology. I want something that is exactly like our current system, but has a new feature, or has a bug fixed. People aren't asking for the same thing, because that's trivial. They're asking for difference. That's why software is so interesting, and why it's also exactly unlike manufacturing. Because people value the difference. You are being asked to do something that doesn't exist before. Now, there are degrees of doesn't exist, some of which may be familiar. You may go, oh, I've seen something like this before. But sometimes it's like, this is new technology. This is a new domain. I don't genuinely know enough to be able to tell you with confidence where we are on this. So what we end up with is a rather curious case, as this team that I referred to had. One of the developers saying, we don't always know how to estimate because it's new. And then, we can't tell sometimes if it's 4 days or 5 days. We can't tell sometimes if it's 5 weeks or 10 weeks. And the product manager there is saying, oh, I had no idea you guys were struggling with this. Remember I said this is all about individuals and interactions, their communication. Clearly, this is a group of people that doesn't talk. Because the product owner says, when I ask for an estimate, I actually want to know, am I talking days? When I'm asking for something, I want to know if it costs me days or months. I don't actually want to know how many days. I want to know days or months. Now, I'm not saying everybody's like this, but it's fascinating that nobody had discovered that when the product owner asked the question, they were asking a different question to the one that the developers were hearing. Now, this is really important. But there are organizations where, those numbers really mean something. Those numbers become a currency. Do you know what happens to currencies? Well, I'm from the UK. We know what happens to currencies. They generally crash. They go up and down. A politician opens their mouth and it crashes. Just shut up, politicians, please. So it's a roller coaster ride. Currencies come under pressure. They come under pressure and they do things like suffer inflation and quantitative easing and all kinds of other wonderful terms. So let's go back to story points, because story points become a currency. They come under pressure. A story point is an arbitrary unit that is trying to decouple from the physical world. Specifically, it's trying to decouple from our perception of time. And so what happens? What happens is that it gets coupled to an expression of time. And people start doing things like, well, that team, first of all, you end up with the observation, different teams have different numbers of story points. And then somebody higher up might make an observation about that. And they go, well, that team gets through more story points than that team. That's because they're using a different currency, except that it's called the same thing. That's very confusing. They've got story points and they've got story points. Oh, yeah, but that's team B's story points versus team A's story points. It's like the difficulty sometimes of talking about the dollar. Which one do you mean? The Hong Kong dollar, the US dollar, the Australian dollar, the Canadian... There's lots of dollars in the world. Unless you specify the context, you could be off by an order of magnitude. The dollar means nothing, okay? So the point there is you need to have a clear context. But then you start putting pressure on it. You don't just have exchange rate issues, you start putting pressure on it. And what happens? You end up with a conversion of story points to time. If this team gets through 100 story points in a sprint, and a sprint is 2 weeks, and that's 10 days, then that's 10 story points a day. You've just converted the thing that decoupled from the physical universe back into something that you can talk about. Okay, so a story point is just under an hour. Let's call it about 40 minutes. 40 to 45 minutes. Okay, if that team, their story point is worth... You've just gone and made a conversion. So what happens now if you are tracking story points against time? If you're saying this team produces this many story points of work in this amount of time, what you've just done is you've said this team does this amount of time in this amount of time. Now, for some of you who may have a numerate degree in your background, and by numerate I don't mean computer science. Computer science is about avoiding numbers. Yeah, computer scientists are afraid of numbers. They do anything that they can to get away from them. I'm talking about science and engineering. You will know that one of the things you're supposed to do when you're given an equation or anything is dimension analysis. That sounds so cool. I'm going to analyze the dimensions. It's not as cool as it sounds. You're just checking the units. It's like velocity. What is velocity? Well, we'll come to that in a minute. What is speed? Speed is meters per second, or it's length per time. And you just do a quick check. Can I assign speed to distance? No, because distance is length, and speed is length per time. These are different units. Okay? But what happens when you plot time against time? When you plot time against time, you have a gradient. So if you are measuring story points against time, what you're actually doing is either you're measuring a team's utilization, how busy they are. Well done, you have measured their busyness. You haven't measured anything about their productivity. In other words, the production of features. Or you are measuring, you're measuring how good your estimates are. We estimated this amount of time and this is how long it took to get it. The one thing you are not measuring is progress in a meaningful sense. So we have this problem. How do we measure the stuff? Well, perhaps we could measure, lines of code is no good. Story points turns out is no good because it's just time. I remember pointing this one out to a Scrum Master a few years ago. He was busy and he preferred the physical approach. He liked to plot it on a graph to make it feel a little less cold and project manager-like. And I said, you do realize you're plotting time against time? And he kind of pointed, paused a moment, and said, oh, crap. People don't think about this. What can we do? Well, why don't we just do stories? Why don't we do features? Features per time. In other words, delivered functionality. Well, how big is a piece of functionality? Well, it can vary hugely. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be exact. It's a little bit like saying, I'll have another drink. How big is another drink? I don't know. It could be this. It could be this. Okay? We have arbitrary units that we use. Another feature. And some features are big and some features are small. But the one thing we can say is if you're producing more features over time, then you will have more features over time. Okay? It's not a perfect thing you can go and measure the gradient of and go, oh, yeah, we dropped 0.13% this. No. This is bad science. You are measuring something you don't have the right to measure. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with the idea that whatever measure we are using, we are normally using a one-dimensional thing against time. So let's talk about velocity. This is a term, originally it came from the extreme programming community, but this is a term that ends up being used to indicate a team's productivity and a team's throughput. And we talk about velocity, whether we talk about it in terms of lines of code or components or features or story points or whatever, we use a one-dimensional thing against time. And people worry about it. They worry about it a lot. They obsess about it. Possibly they obsess about it too much. And what we end up with is a small problem. Teams start comparing their velocity. They don't start comparing, is our software any good? They don't start comparing, are we actually delivering more and is it any good? Is it better? Is the team happy? Do we have a system of people that are comfortable producing what they are doing? What we end up doing is obsessing over a number and tracking it from month to month. Now, all numbers are interesting, but if you start pushing too much pressure on a number, guess what? It fights back. And you get some really weird behaviors. There's Goodhart's law. Goodhart was an economist, and in the 1970s observed that any statistical regularity that is used for observation loses its power of observation or its meaning as a measure when you start using it for control purposes. I can make an observation. The minute I start using it as part of the feedback loop, we must now get to this level. And that level may be anything. When I'm talking about metrics, I'm talking broadly now. It may be to do with code coverage in tests. And people end up going towards 100% statement coverage. And they start going, oh, yeah, we're really close. And then you start looking at the code. And then you start looking at the tests. And you go, oh, I see how people have been getting the number to go up. There's a lot of little tricks you can use. I'm not going to tell you them. You're creative and problem solving. You can figure it out. But let me just give you one technique that I saw in one place. They had really high statement coverage, just no assertions in their test. Yeah? Coverage is not a measure of how good your tests are. It's not even a measure of what you are testing. It's a measure of, has this piece of code touched the lines in this piece of code? There is no measure of assertions. Okay? So be really, really careful with these numbers. But let's go back to velocity. Now, as we are in a technical domain, software is a technical domain, as we are in a technical domain, then we should understand what it is that we are dealing with. When people, and let us use our vocabulary consistent, the word velocity has a technical definition that is used in physics, in English. It has a number of definitions, some of which are casual. That was an interesting dimming. I presume that's to tell me to shut up. It's okay, I will. Thank you. It's nice, we're individuals and interactions. I'm interacting with the lights. So we have this idea of velocity having a meaning, but we flatten the meaning. What is the meaning of velocity? The technical meaning of velocity is not just speed. It is not just distance per time. It is direction. What is the direction that we are taking? When you ask a physicist or a mathematician about velocity, it's a vector quantity. That means it has, let me give you a simple illustration. So there I am. I'm in my car. I'm driving. 100 kilometers per hour. Somebody rings up and say, yeah, how are you doing, Kevlin? What's your, are you near us? Are you nearby? Yeah, I don't know, but I tell you what, I'm going at a good speed. So what's your velocity? Oh, it's 100 kilometers per hour, which actually, when I came in yesterday through Vilnius, that's impossible. I think we managed about 10 kilometers in an hour. So traveling 100 kilometers per hour. Now, I have not answered the question. The question was, what is your velocity? I just gave them my speed. What direction are you heading, Kevlin? I'm heading north. You need to be heading south. Yeah, but I'm heading at a decent speed north. This is the point. If people want to measure velocity, I'm right with them. I think it's a fascinating and important measure. But to measure velocity, you need to understand that you need to include the direction. It is not just about the speed. It's, are we going in the right direction? It turns out 1 meter per hour in the right direction is better than 100 kilometers per hour in the wrong direction. Okay? The point here is that a lot of teams are heading in the wrong direction. It turns out their velocity is poor. Their speed is high. They are busy. In fact, they might be too busy. They're suffering from busyness. And unfortunately, doing agile makes you busy. Being agile makes you less busy. The idea is you are looking for responsiveness. It turns out that what you're interested in is the direction. It's, are we building the right thing? No, but we're doing it really fast. Okay, that's not good. Are we building the right thing in the right way? Well, kind of, we ship a lot of stuff to the customer, and they ship us back a whole load of bug reports. So we have a really good conversation. Yeah, that's not the conversation we want to be having. Are we building the right thing in the right way? Well, I'll tell you what, our technical debt is astronomical. Well, I'm going to suggest that your unmanaged technical debt is a problem rather than a solution. The right way is far more subtle, is far more complex to measure. It's a multidimensional quantity. So let us end the talk by making this observation, that if we are saying that we are measuring the agility of a team, we are actually measuring not their raw speed. We're not even just measuring their velocity, as in their direction, but these are important. We are measuring their ability to respond to change. That's a second-order derivative for those of you that care. It's not velocity, it's acceleration, the ability to change direction. Can this team not only sustain a good velocity, by which we also include the direction, but can they change to go in a new direction? Can they slow down when they see the traffic lights? Again, that's an important consideration. When there is a point in your development where you have to slow down and reassess what you're doing, are you able to do that? Or are you driving without brakes, which I might suggest is very dangerous? So that's the key idea. What we care about in agility is not racking up speed. The secret to not just agile development, but I would say any good development, is the ability to slow down. The ability to see what is actually going on and to make considered reflections on what you do. Thank you very much.